In the early years of the Second World War, the outcome of the conflict was still uncertain. The war had not yet settled into anything predictable. There were no clear endpoints, no obvious conclusions. Instead, there was a sense of constant motion, of events unfolding faster than anyone could fully control. Britain remained in the war, but its position was fragile. As an island nation, its survival depended on ships crossing open water. Food, fuel, raw materials, and military equipment arrived continuously, sustaining both civilian life and the war effort. These shipments moved across vast distances, often through waters that could not be fully monitored or protected. Even small disruptions could ripple outward, affecting factories, rationing, and military planning. Without these crossings, very little else mattered. Germany understood this dependence clearly. It was not a secret weakness, but a structural one. Britain could endure bombing. It could endure military setbacks on land, but it could not endure a prolonged interruption to the flow of goods arriving by sea. At sea, however, Germany faced a limitation of its own. It did not possess a surface navy capable of challenging Britain directly. Large warships required enormous industrial investment, years of construction, and constant protection once deployed. When lost, they could not be replaced quickly. Instead of confronting Britain ship for ship, German naval planners turned to submarines. U-boats offered a different kind of pressure. They did not need to defeat the Royal Navy in open battle. They only needed to make the sea uncertain. Operating alone or in loose coordination, U-boats could travel thousands of miles from their home ports. They could wait unseen, strike without warning, and disappear beneath the surface before escorts could respond effectively. The aim was not dramatic victory. It was steady disruption over time. If enough ships were sunk, or even delayed, Britain's supply system could be strained. Even when ships survived, the effort required to protect them grew steadily, drawing resources away from other parts of the war. In the early phase of the conflict, this strategy appeared to be working. Convoys were thinly protected. Detection technology was limited in range and reliability. Large areas of ocean remained difficult to monitor, especially at night or in poor weather. For the men aboard U-boats, this was the period when their role felt central. They were not experimental. They were not peripheral. They were, for a time, one of Germany's most effective tools. A U-boat was not designed to be lived in comfortably. From the moment a crew member stepped aboard, the lack of space was unmistakable. Passageways were narrow, ceilings were low. Pipes, cables, and valves ran along nearly every surface, leaving little room for movement without constant attention. There was no unused space. Torpedoes occupied large sections of the interior, sometimes stacked beside bunks or secured beneath walkways. Food crates were wedged wherever gaps allowed. Equipment was fixed in place with precision, because anything unsecured could become dangerous once the boat began to move or dive. Moving through the boat required constant awareness. Crew members learned its shape quickly. They stepped over fittings, turned sideways through narrow gaps, and ducked instinctively beneath low obstacles. After a few days, these movements became automatic. The air inside the boat was warm and heavy. When the boat was surfaced, fresh air circulated more freely. When submerged, it did not. Diesel fumes lingered. Oil seeped into clothing and skin. Dampness clung to fabric, paper, and metal alike. Over time, the smells combined. Oil, sweat, food, damp clothing. A mixture that never fully disappeared, no matter how long the patrol lasted. Sound was constant. Diesel engines produced a low mechanical hum that traveled through the hull. When submerged, electric motors added a thinner, higher note. Pumps cycled, Valves opened and closed. Metal creaked as the pressure outside the hull increased or eased. Even when no one spoke, the boat was never quiet. Silence, when it arrived, was deliberate, and it carried weight. Life aboard a U-boat followed its own rhythm. There was no meaningful sense of day or night. Time was divided into watches, usually 4 hours long. Crew members worked, rested, and slept according to a rotating schedule that continued regardless of fatigue. Someone was always awake. Someone was always listening. Without sunlight or external reference points, days blurred together. Weeks passed without clear markers. Time was measured less by dates and more by routine. Routine mattered. Maintenance filled much of each day. Engines were inspected repeatedly. Batteries were monitored carefully, as their capacity limited how long the boat could remain submerged. Condensation was wiped from walls and fittings. Small faults were dealt with immediately, because even minor problems could become serious very quickly in an enclosed environment far from help. Food was eaten whenever space allowed. Early in a patrol, meals were relatively varied. Fresh bread, meat, and fruit were consumed quickly, often within the first week. As time passed, meals became simpler and colder. Tinned food became the norm. Eating was practical rather than social. Often, it was done standing or perched awkwardly wherever there was room. Plates were balanced carefully. Spills were common. There was little ceremony and no fixed meal times. Sleep happened wherever it could. Many crew members shared bunks, sleeping in shifts. A warm bunk usually meant someone else had just vacated it. Sheets were damp. The air was thick. Privacy was almost non-existent. Personal belongings were few. Space did not allow for sentimentality. In quieter moments, crew members found small ways to pass the time. Cards were played when space allowed. Games were slow and repetitive. Letters from home were reread until they were nearly memorized. Some men kept notebooks. Others told the same stories repeatedly, partly from habit and partly to fill the silence. Families were thought about often, but not always spoken of. Letters arrived irregularly and were read carefully, sometimes shared, sometimes kept private. For many, home began to feel distant and unreal, belonging to a different life that continued without them. Tension surfaced occasionally. Living in such close quarters made irritation unavoidable. Small habits became noticeable. Arguments flared and faded quickly, usually over trivial things. There was little space for grudges. The routine did not allow for them. Gradually, the world outside the boat began to recede. News arrived sporadically, filtered through brief radio messages and official language. Political speeches and ceremony had little place inside the steel hull. For many crew members, loyalty became practical rather than ideological. It attached itself to the boat, to the men beside them, and to the routines that kept them functioning. This narrowing of focus was not accidental. It was how life aboard the boat became bearable and eventually survivable. In the early period of the U-boat campaign, crews experienced a sense of control. Convoys were poorly defended, escort vessels were few, and aircraft coverage was limited by range. Large areas of ocean felt empty, particularly at night. U-boats surfaced regularly to recharge batteries and move at speed across open water. Attacks were often successful. This created a powerful impression. The boat felt effective. Careful operation seemed enough to avoid danger. The ocean felt wide, dark, and manageable. Confidence grew gradually. Not recklessness, not bravado, but belief in the system. A sense that discipline, patience, and procedure worked. that if they were followed carefully, the boat would look after the crew. For a time, that belief was justified. From inside the hull, success reinforced routine. Each successful patrol made the next feel more predictable. Each return to port confirmed that the methods worked. This effectiveness was not only recognized on one side. For Allied sailors and merchant crews, the threat of submarines was constant and largely invisible. Ships crossed vast stretches of ocean, knowing they might be watched, tracked, and attacked without warning. There was often no sign of danger until it arrived. This uncertainty shaped behavior at sea. Convoys altered routes. Crews trained repeatedly for attacks they hoped would never come. Survival depended as much on chance as preparation. From inside the U-boat, this unseen presence reinforced the sense of advantage. The boat did not need to be seen to be feared. For the men aboard, belief in the system did not come from ideology. It came from experience. Combat aboard a U-boat rarely arrived suddenly. It unfolded slowly, often over hours, beginning not with action, but with listening. At one end of the boat, a hydrophone operator sat motionless, headphones pressed close, straining to separate distant engine noises from the constant background of the sea. Most of what they heard was meaningless. Water, machinery, the ocean itself. Occasionally, something else emerged, a rhythm that did not belong to the boat, a pattern that suggested movement. When that happened, it was reported quietly. Distances were estimated, bearings were taken, nothing was certain. Everything was inferred. Nearby, navigational calculations were adjusted carefully. Course changes were made in small increments, sometimes by a single degree at a time. The boat crept forward at minimal speed, trading momentum for silence. Inside the hull, movement slowed. Voices dropped, footsteps softened. Equipment was handled with exaggerated care. Even routine tasks were postponed if they risked unnecessary noise. The engineer monitored the boat's systems continuously. Engines were kept at the lowest possible output. Any vibration that could travel through the hull was watched closely. The balance between power and silence was delicate and always shifting. At the center of it all, the commanding officer listened and waited. Information arrived in fragments, sound reports, calculations. Intuition built slowly from experience. Decisions accumulated rather than arriving suddenly. The world outside the boat existed only as sound and abstraction. Nothing could be seen directly. When the moment felt right, orders were given quietly. Torpedo tubes were prepared. Water flooded in. Mechanisms were checked again, even if they had already been checked before. Each step was familiar. No one rushed. Then, the weapons were released. The act itself was brief. Afterward came waiting. The seconds stretched. No one spoke. Every sound was examined for meaning. A dull impact might arrive. A deeper rumble might follow. Sometimes more than one. Only then did certainty emerge. When success was clear, the effect was immediate but restrained. There was relief, not shouting or celebration, but a release of tension that had built steadily over hours. Shoulders relaxed. A few quiet words were exchanged. Someone might allow themselves a brief smile. That moment mattered, but it was fleeting. Almost immediately, attention shifted. Survival mattered more than the outcome. The boat altered course. Depth increased. Engines slowed further. Noise was reduced to the absolute minimum. Now every role reversed. Listening became defensive. Engineering became restraint. Command became patience. The ocean, now alerted, became dangerous. The attack was over. The escape had begun. As the war went on, something began to change. At first, it wasn't dramatic. There was was no single moment when everything felt different. Instead, the ocean slowly became less forgiving. Detection improved. Escorts became more persistent. Aircraft began to appear in areas that had once felt open and quiet. The sense of invisibility faded. Surfacing grew riskier. Patrols became more tense. The margin for error narrowed, often without warning. Then, when the boat was detected, the experience changed completely. Depth charge attacks were no longer brief or hesitant. They came in patterns, repeated and relentless, forcing the boat deeper and deeper. Explosions tore through the water and struck the hull with a force that traveled through the entire vessel. Metal shook. Lights flickered. Dust and debris fell from fittings overhead. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physical. Crew members stopped moving. Engines were shut down or reduced to the bare minimum. Conversation ceased. Tools were secured. Even breathing felt intrusive in the silence between detonations. The boat sank deeper. The pressure outside increased. The heat inside built quickly. Sweat soaked into clothing. The air grew heavy and stale, thick with oil and recycled breath. Every sense narrowed. Sound, pressure, waiting. Each explosion raised the same quiet question. Not whether they were being hunted, but whether this one would be close enough. Sometimes the attacks lasted minutes, sometimes hours. There was no reliable way to tell which it would be. Fear was constant in these moments, but tightly controlled. Panic was dangerous. Stillness was survival. Men learned to stand without shifting their weight, to keep their hands still, to trust the hull to hold, even as it creaked and groaned under the strain. This was the point where earlier confidence stopped being enough. The procedures were the same. The boat was the same. But the environment had changed, and everyone aboard could feel it. As losses mounted, crews adapted again. Fear did not disappear. It changed shape. It stopped arriving in sharp bursts and instead became something steady, something expected. It settled into the background, like the constant hum of machinery, always present even when not consciously noticed. Men became careful in ways they hadn't been before. Movement slowed. Voices stayed low even when there was no immediate need. Equipment was checked twice, sometimes 3 times, not because procedure demanded it, but because habit now did. Sleep came more lightly. Even when exhausted, many crew members slept in short stretches, waking quickly at unfamiliar sounds, or at nothing at all. Losses were known. Boats failed to return from patrol. Familiar names stopped appearing on lists. Empty berths in harbor required no explanation. This was rarely discussed openly. There was little to be gained from speaking about it. The work continued. The routines remained. Acknowledging absence did not change the next patrol order. So the danger became normalized, not accepted, but endured. Life aboard the boat continued because it had to, because stopping was not an option. Life aboard the boat felt immediate and physical. Every decision had weight. Every action had consequence. Heat, noise, fatigue, and fear were experienced directly, without abstraction. The decisions shaping that life, however, were made far away. Patrol areas were assigned from shore-based headquarters. Orders arrived by radio, brief and impersonal, shaped by maps and statistics rather than by lived experience. This created distance. Official language spoke of persistence, duty, and resolve. Inside the boat, life was defined by exhaustion, tightening margins, and a growing awareness of vulnerability. This did not usually produce open defiance. More often, it produced quiet resignation. Trust narrowed. It centered on the commanding officer aboard the boat, on the men sharing the same confined space. on the belief that those immediately present understood what was required to survive. Trust in distant command became conditional. Orders were followed, but no longer assumed to reflect the reality inside the hull. As losses increased, this tension became harder to ignore. The system continued to function, but belief in it became more fragile. As U-boat effectiveness declined, the wider war began to change. For the Allies, control of the Atlantic brought stability. Convoys became more reliable. Supplies arrived in predictable volumes. Planning shifted from survival to coordination. This change was gradual but decisive. Industries expanded. Military operations became larger and more ambitious. The constant uncertainty that had once defined Atlantic shipping slowly receded. For Germany, the change felt different. U-boats continued to patrol. Crews continued to sail, but the sense that their efforts might decisively alter the course of the war faded. The Atlantic became a place of attrition rather than opportunity. Losses mounted without corresponding gains. Each patrol demanded the same endurance as before, but with diminishing impact. By the final stages of the war, relatively few operational U-boats remained. Those that did were often confined to coastal waters, restricted by fuel shortages, air superiority, and constant surveillance. The vast Atlantic patrols of the early war were no longer possible. For many who entered the steel hull and put to sea, survival had always been uncertain. Over time, it became increasingly unlikely. The work continued. The routines held. The boat sailed. Life aboard a U-boat was shaped by environment, routine, and constraint. It was defined by repetition, by waiting, and by moments of fear that arrived without warning. Early confidence narrowed into caution. Caution became endurance. For those inside the hull, history was not abstract. It was heat, noise, and time passing slowly. It was doing the same things every day in the same confined space, while the wider war unfolded far beyond the steel walls. That was the experience. Everything else came later.